Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is a suggested case, and it's the case of Shafilea Ahmed. Now this case was suggested by Natasha, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have. I'd just like to let you know, I mean no disrespect to anyone I'm going to talk about. I've gathered the information off the internet and compiled it into a video for educational purposes. Shafilea Iftikhar Ahmed was born on the 14th of July in 1986 in Bradford, Yorkshire, England, to her parents Fazana and Iftikhar Ahmed. Her parents were initially from the Gujarat district in Pakistan, but they eventually moved to England. Fazana and Iftikhar actually had an arranged marriage as per their religion, of which they were very devout Muslims. The pair almost actually didn't get married though, because Iftikhar was very interested in westernized kind of culture and things like that, so he went travelling. Now when he went travelling, he ended up in Copenhagen where he met a woman. This woman was not a Muslim, but he fell in love with her. He went on to marry her and they had a son together. The Ahmed family were very strict and with their religion, and so they didn't approve of this relationship. They never met this woman, they never met his son, they didn't want anything to do with him. And obviously, they were very religious. So if you swayed from their path, they felt like it brought dishonour and shame on the family. So this woman was called Vivi. And as I said, they started their own family. They led a very non-religious life, even though he was supposed to be this devout Muslim. 4 years passed by and Iftikhar is actually invited back to Pakistan to go and see his grandmother because she's actually dying. When he gets there, his grandmother actually reminds him of a pact that was made when he was young. This pact was created so that he was supposed to marry his second cousin Fazana. And they'd been promised to each other as children. But obviously Iftikhar had a wife at home, he had a son at home. He loved his little family. And his family were trying to force him and push this marriage on him. So they actually went on to arrange this marriage for 3 weeks' time. He wasn't allowed to contact his wife and tell her what was going on. They were just pushing him into it. Fazana kind of knew that he wasn't really that into it. He obviously had this family at home. She realised this, but at the same time, she didn't want to be rejected by him, because please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I see her as damaged goods, but that was how other people in her eyes would see her. If he did actually reject her, she would become these damaged goods and nobody would want her. All the other men in the village were kind of promised to other people, and Fazana wouldn't have a clue what to do because this was who she was promised to. So she tried to convince him to marry her, and she did. She did this by threatening to commit suicide if he didn't. And so he did. He married her. So now Iftikhar had two wives. He had one back in Copenhagen with his son, and he was now married to Fazana. He ended up ringing Vivi and telling her to move to England, pack up the stuff, get the son and just move there, and she did. He obviously went home. He joined his wife and his son in England, and everything was okay for 2 weeks until Fazana turned up at the doorstep. She was pregnant. That was when Vivi found out about everything that had gone on, that her husband literally went away to go and see his dying grandmother and ended up with this wife who was now pregnant. She was enraged, she was furious, of course she would be. So she left, she ended the relationship and she moved back to Copenhagen with her son. And now Iftikhar was married to Fazana, so they started their life together. They got a house in Warrington and they bought it just in time for the arrival of their first daughter, Shafilea. They actually went on to have 5 children, and they were brought up with these very strict beliefs. Fazana would ensure that they all kind of upheld their faith. She was very much the head of the house. She very much took on that role. She also took a role as being a wife very seriously. She made sure she cleaned and cooked every day, did everything that was expected of a wife in her eyes, and anything to do with raising the children or sort of the house was her responsibility. Fazana believed that her 4 daughters should model themselves after her mother, respecting their beliefs, and that they should follow them as strictly as she had. And if any of her kids misbehaved or behaved in a way that she didn't deem as fit, then she would abuse them. By all accounts, all the children were really well behaved, but the smallest of things would anger her, and that would result in this abuse. One occasion, when Shafilea did something wrong, Fazana, actually something minor as well, it wasn't something major, it was something very minor, she locked her in a bedroom for several days without food or water. I have read as well that there was an incident with a sock that I believe Shafilea threw a sock at a sibling, literally a material sock, and she got badly abused for it and was disciplined for it. It kind of became a running theme that Shafilea would pretty much get the brunt of it most of the time. The other children did get abused too, but Shafilea was more at the forefront of it. Now, we don't know whether that was because she was the oldest, because in A Mother Dies she was the one that misbehaved the most, or because she just didn't like her. Now, Shafilea was this lovely young girl who was very interested in her education. She wanted to better herself. She wanted to do all these things, and she worked very hard for it. She was very serious about that. She was very respectful of others, well behaved, and she was just turning out to be this wonderful young lady. However, it did seem that no matter how hard Shafilea tried, no matter what she did, her parents, it was never good enough for them. It just wasn't, and they would always feel like she was doing something wrong and would just punish her for it, even if she probably wasn't. Her mother became really angry when Shafilea was interested in kind of westernized culture, and she began adopting some of these traits from her friends, but she didn't feel like that was acceptable at all. All she was doing was being like her friends. Yes, okay, she's raised in this very devout Muslim household, but she's also being raised around these kind of westernized people all the time who wear these certain clothes, and obviously you're going to pick up traits for them. If you like the look of their clothes or their style or anything like that, you're going to want to wear them. It's just normal. Shafilea began making friends with non-Muslim people. She began talking to boys, and this kind of thing just enraged her mother even more. It would result in the parents calling their teenage daughter these horrendous names. When Shafilea dyed her hair, painted her nails, which is what a lot of young girls at that age do, it's completely normal. Her mother just hated it. She just didn't deem anything acceptable that she seemed to do. Honestly, looking into this case, Shafilea, no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, no matter whether she did things wrong or not, she was always punished back for it. They just didn't accept her, and they punished her for everything. Shafilea did end up talking to school friends about what she was being kind of subjected to at home, the abuse from her parents, on a daily basis. And most of the time she didn't even know why she was being abused. And the Ahmeds, if they physically abused their children, obviously they left marks, bruises, things like that. They wouldn't be allowed to go to school. They couldn't have anyone knowing that they abused their kids. One time, Fazana strangled Shafilea, and I mean, she did it that hard that it left this massive, huge bruise across her neck. She was off school for weeks because, well, she couldn't go in like that. They would know what she was doing. So she was kept off of school for weeks until the bruise started to fade, and then obviously she was allowed to go back in. I do believe all the children were abused, but Shafilea was kind of at the forefront of it. She received the most abuse. By all accounts, Shafilea would end up having bad attendance at school. Despite her having good grades, she would be often kept off school because she would have these marks and these injuries and these bruises, and her parents didn't want anyone to find out. So the teacher did begin to get worried. She had these really good grades, she seemed really interested in school, but a lot of the time she was off and she wasn't there. So while Shafilea was off one time, one of the teachers actually rang her household. They begged to speak to Shafilea, and eventually they did allow it. And this teacher asked if Shafilea was okay, and she said that she was fine. And the teacher actually said to her, "Do I need to be worried about you?" And Shafilea replied yes, and then put the phone down. Now, I don't know what happened about this. Obviously the teacher would have been worried. I don't know whether they pressed more into this, whether they spoke to anyone about it. I couldn't find any information on that. So I don't know where that did lead to. But it seriously breaks my heart. The abuse that these children and Shafilea endured by her parents, of all people, and they hid it, which of course they would. They didn't want anyone finding out. They didn't want the shame bringing on the family. They didn't want anyone knowing what they were doing. When Shafilea got her first job, her parents weren't happy about it, but they did allow it. They allowed her to go to work under these strict rules. So she would have to be dropped off and picked up by one of her parents. They would monitor her bank account. They would watch what she spent her money on. They would spend her money. They would withdraw money from her account without telling her. And they just wanted to control every aspect of her life. She wasn't allowed any kind of privacy, really, at all. She wasn't allowed to do anything, apart from obviously go to school and go to work, which was strictly controlled by them. If she was full of bruises, she couldn't go. She even shared a room with 3 sisters at home, so when she got home, there was no privacy there. She was in with her sisters. It was just awful. When Shafilea turned 16, the school was so concerned over her welfare that they decided to contact social services. But obviously, the parents were contacted. They said everything was fine, which of course they will do. And by all accounts, social services dropped the case without really doing too much digging into it. And that completely breaks my heart, because what actually ended up happening to Shafilea was horrendous. And if social services may have looked into it, maybe they could have stopped it. Maybe they could have saved her life. It's just completely and utterly devastating. At the age of 16, Shafilea went on to write to the council. She asked them for emergency housing. And if that's not a cry out for help, then I don't know what is. She went on to say that she was beaten daily, she was abused, there was no room in her house, it was very cramped. She stated that while she was being abused, one parent would hold her down while the other would hit her. She had obviously no privacy, and that she was subject to mental abuse by her parents, and that she just had to get out of her family home for her own safety. Shafilea, like I said, had all these high ambitions. She wanted to go to college, she wanted to do her A-level, she wanted to go to university to train to become this lawyer. When she spoke to her family about it, they just basically said, no, you don't need any of that. Because she was going to be going back to Pakistan for an arranged marriage to somebody she didn't know, and that would just be her life. This wasn't what Shafilea wanted for herself. She wanted to work in the job that she wanted to aspire, kind of train for all them years, and get the job that she wanted, the career she wanted. She wanted a boyfriend who she met herself, Muslim or non-Muslim. She would make that choice. She didn't want the life that her parents had planned out for her, and it terrified her. Even if your family is very devout religion, that doesn't mean that you have to follow it. You are your own person. And yes, okay, they may kind of shun you from the family or something like that, but it's your choice, and it should have been Shafilea choice, but they didn't give her that choice. So Shafilea began stockpiling clothes at school in a locker. She was taking little bits of items here and there, kind of trying to make it not obvious what she was doing, but she was trying to plan an escape. Shafilea planned with a friend one night that she would escape the house. She'd crawl out through the window. A friend was there waiting for a car for her, and that they would just go. And that's what they did. They were on the run, I guess, for a couple of days before the police did find them and brought them back to their parents. Shafilea was then back with her abusive parents. She was a minor, so the police had no choice, but they weren't aware of the abuse that was going on. She didn't give up. She tried a few times. She tried to escape a few times. Each time she was just brought back. And this began to worry her family, because in their eyes, one of their children constantly trying to escape, if the news got out, it would bring shame on their family. So they came up with a plan. This plan was to bring this arranged marriage forward as soon as they could, and to get Shafilea over to Pakistan into this arranged marriage before she brought any more shame to the family. Her parents knew she wouldn't go along with it, so they didn't tell her. They lied to her. Their plan was basically to try and get her over there, cancel her return ticket, maybe take away her passport or hide it or whatever else, get her married to this person, and then basically she would become their problem. They would come back home and they wouldn't have to deal with her anymore. Now, when this sudden trip to Pakistan came up, Shafilea was quite intelligent, as I said. She knew that her parents were going to plan this for her, and so she just refused to go. She just blatantly said, no, not going. And no matter how much they beat her, which they did, they beat her repeatedly, they tried to force her into going so badly. She was having none of it. She point blank refused, and she would not go. And I admire her for that. I admire her. She endured the abuse that they confronted her with, and she still said no. And that takes strength, and that takes courage. And she definitely should be admired for that, for standing up to her parents. But her parents were vindictive, and they conspired against her. They decided that they were going to drug her instead. They needed to get her on this flight, and that would be the only way. So Iftikhar went to his GP, said that he was suffering from insomnia. They gave him sleeping pills. Now, bearing in mind, Iftikhar was obviously a lot bigger than Shafilea. This dose was for a man of his height and weight. But regardless, the morning of the flight, Fazana crushed up these pills more than necessary, more than what was prescribed to him, and put them in a drink. It knocked Shafilea completely out. She was a petite 16-year-old girl. They gave her way too much. She woke up mid-flight on her way to Pakistan, and she must have been devastated. I can't imagine how upset and frightened and just how betrayed she would have felt that her parents had actually done this to her. Just must have been awful. When they landed, they took her off a passport offer. They told Shafilea that they had planned for her to marry her first cousin, who was 25 years old, despite Shafilia's wishes. She was terrified. She didn't want this life that she was being forced into. It was not her plan. It was not something she wanted. And so she decided that she no longer wanted to live, and so she tried to kill herself. She got hold of a bottle of bleach. She drank more than half of it. Now, the thing with bleach is, in the case of suicides, it is so corrosive. It literally burns your insides. So she would have had burns all down her mouth, her throat, esophagus, her stomach, and it wasn't successful. And a lot of the time, because of your physiology and how much you drink, a lot of the time it isn't successful, but it is very painful. And Shafilea's attempt wasn't successful. So she was now in a lot of pain with these burns, suffering in so much agony, and she was still alive. Her parents didn't take her for medical treatment. They didn't care. She was just very ill for a very long time. Shafilia's cousin, when he heard about this, he didn't want anything to do with her. He called off the marriage. He said that she was these damaged goods, and he just didn't want anything to do with her. As you can imagine, her parents were outraged. They were furious that she brought this shame on the family. They basically gathered the stuff and they left her there. They went home, leaving Shafilea in Pakistan. Shafilea was actually staying with some relatives, and she couldn't eat, she couldn't drink. She was so poorly, and they actually contacted her parents and told them that they needed to come for her because they thought she was dying. And they did come for her. But when they got her back home, they didn't seek medical attention for her, they just left her to it. She was a 16-year-old teenage girl who was gravely ill, suffering in so much pain, and she had to take herself to the hospital. She had to make her own way there because her parents just didn't care. Obviously, when she got there was questions. Why the heck had she drank this bleach? So they asked the parents, and the Ahmeds just said, whilst there was in Pakistan, there was this power cut, and Shafilea picked up the bleach and drank it, thinking it was a bottle of fruit juice. Now, Shafilea would require a lot of treatment to recover from this. As I said, her burns and stuff were extensive, and she had other medical issues that came along with it. And when she was finally released from hospital, she needed a lot of help, but her parents didn't. They didn't care that their teenage daughter was so ill, she could barely eat, she could barely wash herself. They didn't help at all. They just left her to it. It took months and months for Shafilea to recover, and she did. Although she didn't recover fully from it, she recovered to a point where she felt like she could go back to work and back to school. Shafilea was still receiving medical care when she went missing. On the 11th of September 2003, Fazana picked up her daughter from work like she would normally do. And when Shafilea came out, she was absolutely amazed by what she was wearing. She was wearing these very westernized clothes. She was wearing normal clothes, what most people would see as normal clothes. This t-shirt, just a normal kind of sort of short sleeve t-shirt, and she was wearing these white stiletto heels, and Fazana was furious. They had this big row. She deemed it unacceptable what she was wearing. She said it was totally inappropriate, and she was furious. When they got home, Shafilea's mother demanded to look in a handbag, and Shafilea refused. I don't know whether she was trying to look for something or just, I don't know, wanted to invade her privacy like she normally would, but Shafilea was 17 now. She had the right to her privacy. She didn't want her mother to look in a handbag, and so she wouldn't let her, which probably just enraged her even more. The very next day, on the 12th of September 2003, Shafilea was supposed to go to school, to work, and she didn't turn up. Her teachers, her friends, were all questioning where she was, but no one had heard anything from them. Obviously, teachers had previously rang social services because they were concerned, and so they were concerned enough to ring the police. This would cause a massive investigation. There would be appeal after appeal for information on the media, and even an actress, Shubhana Gulati, became involved in the case, kind of appealing for information. So police spoke to the Ahmeds. Why had they not reported their daughter was missing? Why was a school reporting it? They basically said that she'd run away, and they didn't report it because a child running away from her home would bring shame and dishonour on their family. And the police believed them. The police didn't even use Shafelea's full name in the news to try and prevent this shame and dishonour being brought on the Ahmeds, and so they just used the first name in all of the appeals. The police spoke to everyone, her friends, her teachers, family members, and they began to sort of paint this picture as to what Shafelea's life was like. Also, every time Shafilea ran away, she would inform a friend. She would tell them what was going on. And this time there was just nothing. Nobody knew anything about her plans to run away. And so it was strange. They went to speak to her siblings, and her siblings basically let on to say that they didn't know anything. But the police kind of felt like they knew more than what they were telling them. As I said, they began to build this picture of what her life was like at home. They became aware of the abuse that she was suffering daily at the hands of her parents, the bruises that people had seen, the things that she shared with her friends. They were just building up their suspicions against the Ahmed family. So much so, they actually bugged the home. They put in these recording devices to try and see whether anyone would mention anything about what happened to Shafilea. They knew that they wouldn't confess to being involved in their daughter's disappearance, and so this was their way of trying to find information on it. Although they never really said anything specific, they did say some very suspicious things like, would the police find anything forensically in their car? And they were telling their other children, to keep their mouth shut in school and things like that, not telling one, but they never actually said what they were keeping their mouth shut about. However, when they had heard this, they went round and they arrested the Ahmeds for obviously kidnapping the daughter. They obviously denied the charges, of course, but they were acting so suspiciously. They had taken down all the photos of Shafilea from the house. There was not one photo of her in their house any longer. They never referred to Shafilea by her name. They always referred to her as the child or the girl, which was very strange. This was their daughter that they supposedly loved. They couldn't even say her name. And they seemingly didn't really know anything about her. Their 17-year-old daughter that they've raised, they didn't really know her. They didn't know anything about her. They couldn't really describe literally her interests or anything like that. They just didn't have a clue. Despite this, police had nothing concrete. They didn't have any evidence against them. And in the end, they had to let them go. In February 2004, 5 months after Shafilea had gone missing, a body washed up on the bank of the River Kent, which was around about 70 miles from Warrington. The body was that badly decomposed, it was barely passable as a human, which obviously made identifying this person very, very difficult. It was eventually identified by jewellery and dental records, and it was found that the body was that of Shafilea Ahmed. As I said, it was so badly decomposed that her cause of death couldn't be ascertained, but they believe that she had probably been dead since basically her disappearance. They launched a murder investigation, and you guessed it, the Ahmed family were the top suspects. They pretty much knew that the Ahmeds had murdered their daughter, but without any evidence, they couldn't do anything about it. So the search into what happened to Shafilea would slowly run cold until 2010. 6 years later, they finally got a breakthrough in the case, when one of her younger sisters, Alicia, who was now 22-year-old, she was at university and she was struggling with money. She had arranged a robbery on her own home on the 25th of August in 2010. So she hatched this plan that she would be home with her family and everyone, and that her friends would come in and burgle the house. So her friends came in, they tied up everyone, but they didn't tie up Alicia. Immediately, her parents figured that she was involved, because why was she not tied up? So when the robbery had taken place, they rang the police, of course, and they insisted that the daughter had something to do with it. Whilst being questioned about this fake robbery that she'd arranged, she asked the police if they could turn off the tape, the recording tape, and speak to them about another matter. She told the police that her sister was in fact murdered by her parents in an honour killing right in front of everyone, right in front of her siblings. the youngest of which at the time was just 7 years old. She stated that Shafilea had come home wearing this stereotypicalized Western clothing, as I stated, and that enraged her parents. It just kind of tipped them over the edge. It transformed the abuse that she'd received daily into murder. Her family had always believed that she brought shame on their family, and this was their tipping point. Iftikhar began beating her like he did every day. Fazana then shouted in Arabic, "Just finish it here." She then held Shafilea on the sofa, where Iftikhar kind of scrunched up a plastic bag and put it into her mouth. He then covered the rest of Shafilia's face so that she couldn't breathe. Just for good measure, in case the bag didn't work, I guess, he leant his knee on her chest with all of his weight on it, restricting her lungs so that even if the bag didn't kill her, she wouldn't be able to breathe regardless. They apparently stayed there for around 10 minutes just to make sure that she died. And as I said, it was done in front of all the children, so they were all witnesses to it. They then made the children swear on the Quran that they would never ever tell anyone what they had done that day, otherwise they would meet the same fate. The kids were then sent upstairs, and Alicia then recalls 20 minutes later looking out the window, seeing her father carrying this black bag, a human-sized black bag, into the car. And because of this, 51-year-old Iftikhar Ahmed and 48-year-old Fazana Ahmed were arrested and charged with the murder of Shafilea Ahmed in 2011. Alicia would actually be placed into witness protection because they feared that other members of her family, for possibly what she did to her parents, in their eyes, I guess, betraying them, even though they committed murder, that it might kind of put a target on her back and her life might be at risk. So she was put into protection for it. Another witness did come forward as well, one of Shafilia's younger sisters. She had gone into school and told her about the events that had happened, that she witnessed her sister's murder and that she couldn't tell anyone. And this person wrote down everything. They wrote down everything that they were told at the time. They kept a diary and it was all in there. So they also used this as evidence in trial too. The trial began in 2012, and on the 3rd of August, they were both found guilty of Shafilea Ahmed's murder and were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years. Police did suspect that the pair would have had help to kind of dispose of her body, but no one was ever arrested on this matter as of yet. This case is so tragic, and I really despise cases like this because these kind of cases with the abuse where there are kind of signs and things like that, and with all her bruising, all her injuries, the teachers worried, her attendance at school, and yet nobody really knew what was going on behind closed doors. I just think it's really sad when there are signs like this and the cases end up like this one in such a tragic way. I truly am heartbroken that her own parents murdered their daughter because in their eyes she brought shame on the family, because she was too westernized for them and didn't want to live their lifestyles. I've said this before, yes, religion is important and I do think that, but it should be your choice if you want to believe in it or not. It shouldn't be forced on you. Shafilea didn't want to follow her parents' footsteps. She didn't want to live that life. She wanted to make her own way in her own life. And so they should have just kind of like let her go. I know families disown the children and things like that to prevent this shame being brought on them. That's what they should have done. Yes, it's hard losing all your family, but she was murdered. That is never the answer. At least without a family that she was being abused for so many years, she could have started a new life. She could have become a lawyer and raised a family of her own and found the perfect man for her. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. This 17-year-old girl tried her very best for her parents and nothing was ever good enough, and it's just so sad how it ended. But yeah, if you guys have any more suggestions, please do let me know and I'll look into them for you. If you like this video, give it a big thumbs up and subscribe if you enjoy my content. Anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of Shafilea Ahmed. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye!